Good morning. You're looking live at a view of Space Launch Complex 4 East at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California, where SpaceX is counting down to liftoff at 3:46 a.m. Pacific time. That is 6:46 a.m. Eastern time, with the Surface Water and Ocean Topography Satellite, also known as SWOT. This is a joint project between NASA and the French space agency CNES that will focus on measuring the height or water levels in lakes, rivers, reservoirs, and the oceans around the world. Liftoff now is about 41 minutes away. And the next major milestone in the countdown will be the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9. That is due to begin in about 6 minutes or so. This launch was scheduled to happen yesterday around this time. However, SpaceX and NASA agreed to delay the launch 24 hours to perform some additional analyses on 2 of the 9 engines on the Falcon 9 rocket's first stage booster. Teams detected a signature of moisture in those engines during launch preparations earlier this week, and they performed additional inspections on those engines to determine the source of the moisture. And after another review of the data and the results from those inspections yesterday, NASA launch managers and SpaceX launch managers agreed to proceed with the countdown this morning at Vandenberg Space Force Base in California for liftoff again at 3:46 a.m. Pacific time, 6:46 a.m. Eastern time. For those of you watching in other time zones around the world, that is 11:46 UTC. This is the first of 3 Falcon 9 rockets that SpaceX is preparing to launch over the next couple of days. Later today at Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, SpaceX is scheduled to launch a Falcon 9 rocket at 4:21 p.m. Eastern time, about 10 hours or so from now, with the first 2 satellites in a planned 11 satellite constellation that the company SES is developing to provide broadband internet service. And then on Saturday at Kennedy Space Center in Florida, SpaceX is readying a Falcon 9 rocket for launch with the next batch of Starlink internet satellites. But this mission at Vandenberg Space Force Base, awaiting launch this morning, is carrying an environmental monitoring satellite called the Surface Water and Ocean Topography Satellite, also known as SWOT. The SWOT satellite weighs about 2.2 metric tons, about 4,850 pounds, fully fueled on top of the Falcon 9 rocket, and is heading to orbit this morning on a planned 3-year mission to use a radar instrument to measure the height of water in freshwater bodies as well as the oceans around the world. This mission will help scientists do research into the behavior of Earth's water cycle, how the water cycle is responding to climate change, and also will measure rising sea levels in the oceans around the world. Data from the SWOT mission will also help water resource managers better keep track of how much water is in reservoirs. These reservoirs are used for irrigation and to provide water to cities around the world. And the data from this mission will also be useful, according to scientists, in predicting where floods and droughts may occur and helping officials respond to those events, which are more extreme and occurring more frequently due to climate change. So we're about 37 minutes away from launch. We're standing by for the start of propellant loading on the Falcon 9 rocket. Countdown is now at T-minus 31 minutes and 30 seconds. Propellant loading has begun. That began at T-minus 35 minutes. So about 1 million pounds of kerosene and liquid oxygen are now flowing into the Falcon 9 rocket at Vandenberg Space Force Base, California. Currently, kerosene and liquid oxygen are flowing into the first stage of the Falcon 9. Kerosene is also flowing into the upper stage at this time. Liquid oxygen, the super cold oxidizer, will begin flowing into stage 2 at T-minus 16 minutes. So right now the countdown is on schedule for launch at 3:46 a.m. Eastern, or Pacific time rather, 6:46 a.m. Eastern time, 11:46 UTC. For those of you tracking exact launch times, the exact launch time for today is 3:46 and 47 seconds. So 47 seconds after the minute, 3:46:47 Pacific is the precise target launch time for this mission, 30 minutes and 30 seconds away. Weather conditions at Vandenberg are favorable with pretty decent visibility at this time. There are some scattered high-level clouds reported over the spaceport. But going into this countdown operation, the official weather forecast out at Vandenberg called for 100% chance of favorable weather, 0% chance of violating any weather constraints. If you're just joining us, we're receiving these views from NASA and SpaceX cameras. They're feeding these views to us from Vandenberg Space Force Base. So we want to thank NASA and SpaceX for this access to these cameras. Also, please hit the like button here on our YouTube stream if you haven't done so yet. So if you hit that thumbs up button, that helps us gain a larger audience for our coverage. We want to bring this launch to as many people as possible. Now inside of a half hour until this morning's launch.
Stage 1 Pogo. Stage 1 Pogo. Stage 2 RP1 load complete. Stage 2 RP1 load complete.
Now inside of 20 minutes until liftoff. The big vent is now underway on the strongback out at Space Launch Complex 4 East. This coincides with what we've just heard from the SpaceX launch team, that the upper stage kerosene fuel tank has now been fully loaded with rocket-grade kerosene, and chill down or thermal conditioning of the liquid oxygen loading line that runs up that strongback is now beginning. This thermally conditions that flow line where the liquid oxygen will be flowing into the upper stage ahead of the actual loading of that oxidizer into the rocket upper stage, which begins at T-minus 16 minutes, about 3 minutes from now. Again, the mission today is to carry the SWOT satellite into orbit. This is the Surface Water and Ocean Topography mission. The spacecraft will measure the height of water in lakes, rivers, and oceans around the world. This mission has been in the works since about 2007, when a decadal survey, a National Academy's survey of Earth science priorities, identified this type of mission as a high priority. And a few years later, NASA joined up with the French space agency, CNES, to begin development of the SWOT mission. Full-scale development began in 2014, leading up to this launch in December 2022. The main instrument on this particular satellite is a Ka-band radar interferometer. This radar is called CARIN, that's the acronym. It will deploy from the spacecraft beginning about 4 days after the launch. And that deployment process itself will run about 4 days in a very carefully choreographed step-by-step sequence. There's 2 booms that will extend from the body of the spacecraft, and that boom will span about 33 feet or 10 meters tip to tip. And on each end of the boom will be a radar receiver, and on one side will be a radar transmitter. So the instrument works by transmitting a Ka-band radar pulse down to the ground, and then the spacecraft measures how long it takes for that radar signal to bounce off the Earth's surface and contact or be received by the 2 receivers on this Ka-band radar instrument. And by that, the scientists can derive the distance from the satellite to Earth's surface with great precision, allowing the scientists to determine the height of the ocean, the height of ocean waves, as well as the elevation of water in reservoirs and rivers. That'll help determine how much water is in a lake. That'll help determine the flow rates of water in rivers, and we'll also be able to monitor rising sea levels that way. Again, this is a joint mission between NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, the French space agency CNES, the UK space agency,
Stage 2 LOX load has started.
Satellite weighs about 2.2 metric tons, and will be heading to an operational orbit of 553 miles or 891 kilometers. This spacecraft will be deployed a little bit lower than that at about 530 miles or so, about 857 kilometers, by the Falcon 9 rocket. That's where it'll perform its initial checkouts and deployment operations, and then later in the coming weeks will use its thrusters to climb about 20 miles higher, 30 kilometers or so higher, into the science orbit to begin its 3-year primary mission. This mission has cost about $1.2 billion to get to this point. About 2/3 of that has come from the US, and the majority of the remainder of that sum has been provided by the French Space Agency. Here's some views of the SWOT satellite. On the left is a view of the spacecraft as it was encapsulated inside the payload fairing of the Falcon 9 rocket at Vandenberg Space Force Base. On the upper right is a view of the SWOT spacecraft at the factory where it was assembled at Thales Alenia Space in Cannes, France. The instrument, the Karen Ka-band radar, was developed at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, whereas the spacecraft bus, the satellite that hosts the instrument, was built in France. The lower right is a good view, an artist's concept of what the SWOT satellite will look like with its solar panels and the 2 booms of the radar that you see down below the solar panels fully deployed in orbit. Liquid oxygen loading on the second stage has now been confirmed to be underway. So that's the final propellant tank of the 4 to be loaded this morning. Here's a look at the countdown timeline. We've passed the start of propellant loading, which started at T-minus 35 minutes. And we've passed the T-minus 16-minute mark, which was the start of liquid oxygen loading on the second stage. Coming up at T-minus 7 minutes will be the thermal conditioning or chill down of the 9 Merlin 1D engines on the bottom of the first stage. At about T-minus 6 minutes, we should hear a call from SpaceX's launch team out in California that the kerosene tanks on the first stage and second stage are both full. At 4.5 minutes, we'll see the strongback mast next to the Falcon 9 begin to recline to an angle of about 13 degrees from the rocket. That retraction of the strongback will take about a minute or two. It actually goes back a little bit farther from the rocket out at Vandenberg than the strongback does for SpaceX launches from here in Florida, where I'm reporting from this morning. At T-minus 2 minutes, we expect to hear a call that liquid oxygen loading has been completed. And at T-minus 60 seconds, the control of the countdown will be transitioned to the Falcon 9's onboard computer from the ground computer, and the Falcon 9's own computer will take control of the countdown and monitor all the key systems leading up to liftoff. We'll also oversee the final pressurization of the rocket. And then at T-minus 45 seconds, SpaceX's launch director will give their final go for launch, and the engine ignition command will be issued at T-minus 3 seconds leading up to liftoff. Now 12 minutes, 37 seconds until liftoff of the Falcon 9 with the SWOT mission, a joint effort by NASA and the French space agency CNES. It's 8 minutes, 30 seconds. Here's a look at the expected ground track for this launch. It'll be heading off to the southwest from Vandenberg Space Force Base out over the Pacific Ocean. This trajectory to the southwest is actually selected to ensure that the rocket does not fly over the Channel Islands on its way into orbit, as well as minimizes the rocket's time over the ground, both on the outbound leg of the journey of the launch, as well as the booster's return to Vandenberg Space Force Base for landing. The first stage will be returning to landing zone 4 at Vandenberg about 7.5 minutes after launch. And that landing zone is just about 500 meters or so from the launch pad, very close to the Space Launch Complex 4 East area at Vandenberg. So here's a look at the map. The red trace, of course, is the expected ground track as it heads off southwest from Vandenberg. And then when the upper stage takes over the mission, a few minutes into the flight, it will actually vector its thrust to steer the rocket on a more southerly trajectory to line up with the targeted orbital track or orbital plane for the surface water and ocean topography satellite. In this map, if you look closely, you can see Space Launch Complex 4 East labeled here on the right. That's SLIC 4E. On the left is SpaceX landing zone number 4. That's the landing site for the booster. So here's the launch pad on the right, the landing pad on the left. Again, as you notice, it's just a few hundred meters that separate these two facilities. If you've been watching landings at the Cape, the landing zone is between 6 and 10 miles from the pad, depending on which launch site SpaceX uses in Florida. Here in Vandenberg, it is much closer together. And here is a glimpse, a snapshot of the major post-flight events we expect this morning. The Falcon 9 will surpass the speed of sound in less than a minute. And the first stage engines will cut off about 2 minutes, 16 seconds into the flight and will detach from the upper stage a few moments later and begin a boost back burn with 3 of its engines. Meanwhile, the upper stage will continue into orbit with its single Merlin engine. Landing of that first stage is expected about 7 minutes, 35 seconds after launch. About a minute later, the second stage will cut off after reaching a preliminary parking orbit with the SWOT spacecraft after flying over Antarctica and heading back north. On the other side of the Earth, the upper stage will reignite briefly, about 5 seconds, to place the SWOT spacecraft into its targeted orbit for separation, which is scheduled for T plus 52 minutes, 28 seconds.
Stage 1 fuel load correction.
Everything looking good right now, 5 minutes and 40 seconds until launch. We've heard the calls in the last couple of minutes of the startup chill down of the Merlin 1D engines on the first stage booster. And we've also heard that the kerosene tank on the first stage is fully loaded. So about 46,000 gallons of kerosene has been loaded into the vehicle. Everything looking good. Again, 5 minutes, 10 seconds. The next major milestone will be the retraction of the strongback.
Tanks are pressing for strongback retract.
And limb on countdown 1. And limb copies.
3 minutes, 30 seconds. You're hearing some periodic callouts from the Launch Control Center at Vandenberg. That was the voice of Tim Dunn, the NASA launch manager, who is NASA's representative on the launch team, responsible for ensuring that all is ready for the launch of this NASA SWOT satellite, an environmental monitoring satellite heading into polar orbit, or a very high inclination orbit, from Vandenberg Space Force Base in about 3 minutes. We're seeing the strong back now retracting from the Falcon 9.
LD, NLM, countdown 1. LD, go ahead. NASA is go for SWOT launch.
And there's the call from Tim Dunn, the NASA launch manager, confirming that NASA is go for launch. NASA is go for launch of the soil, or the surface water and ocean topography satellite. Two minutes, 22 seconds. Everything looking good, approaching the T-minus 2 minute mark.
This is the Rock, range is green.
Stage
2
two,
minutes to
launch
launch,
complete.
everything looking good at Vandenberg Space Force Base for the liftoff of a Falcon 9 rocket.
Falcon 9 is in startup.
Falcon 9 has been transitioned to startup mode. The onboard computer now controlling the countdown. Liftoff in about 40 seconds.
Launch director.
Vent valves on the Falcon 9 are now closed to pressurize the propellant tanks. So you're now seeing the venting from the Falcon 9 and the strong back decreasing as that pressurization continues. 30 seconds to go until liftoff.
T-minus 15 seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6.
Standing by for
5,
liftoff of the Falcon
4,
9.
3, 2, 1.
There's the water suppression
Ignition
system, sound suppression
and
water,
liftoff
and
of
engine
Falcon
start.
9 with the surface
And
water, ocean
liftoff of
topography SWOT
SpaceX's
mission.
Falcon 9 rocket with the surface water and ocean topography
Falcon 9 is
satellite
pitching down
from
range.
Vandenberg Space Force Base in
Stage 1
California.
propulsion is
Everything
nominal.
looking good. Here's a great onboard camera view from the Falcon 9 as it climbs off of Space Launch Complex 4. Now 30 seconds into the flight of the Falcon 9 with SWOT. Falcon 9 now heading downrange. Again, it's pitching on a trajectory toward the southwest from Vandenberg Space Force Base to fly out over the Pacific Ocean. Approaching T+1 minute, Falcon 9 is now supersonic.
Falcon 9 is supersonic.
Now less than a minute remaining until
Max
main
Q.
engine cutoff on the first stage.
MVAC engine chill.
the call that the engine chill down on the Merlin vacuum engine on the upper stage is underway. This conditions that upper stage engine for its upcoming burn. About 30 seconds remaining in the first stage burn. Those 9 engines are producing 1.7 million pounds of thrust. Plus 2 minutes standing by for main engine cutoff and stage separation, followed immediately by upper stage engine ignition.
Miko.
Stage separation.
Main engine
confirmed.
cutoff. There's a stage separation, view of the upper stage separating from the booster,
MVAC
and
ignition.
ignition
Stage
of the
1,
Merlin
back
vacuum
startup.
engine. That MVAC engine is now glowing red hot in the pre-dawn sky over Vandenberg Space Force Base, and there's ignition of the booster, firing 3 of its engines for a boost back maneuver. This maneuver essentially zeroes out the downrange velocity of the first stage and then reverses its course back toward Vandenberg Space Force Base to head for landing at landing zone 4. This burn will last about 30 seconds.
Fairing separation.
And you can see the
confirmed.
dueling exhaust plumes from the booster as well as the upper stage engine. And there's payload fairing jettison. The nose shroud on the Falcon 9 rocket has separated in a clamshell-like fashion to reveal the surface water and ocean topography, or SWOT, spacecraft to the space environment for the first time. Approaching T plus 3.5 minutes, everything looking good so far.
Stage 1, boost back shutdown.
The Merlin vacuum engine is producing more than 200,000 pounds of thrust.
Both stages are on nominal trajectories.
Now past T plus 5 minutes, everything continuing to look good. So right now the upper stage is firing its single engine to place the SWOT spacecraft into a low altitude parking orbit. About 3 minutes are remaining in this burn of the upper stage engine. Meanwhile, the booster has deployed its aerodynamic hypersonic grid fins and is now about a minute, a little less than a minute now, away from an entry burn that will again reignite 3 of the 9 engines on the first stage as a braking maneuver, a retro rocket burn to slow down as it dips deeper into the atmosphere, targeting a landing or return to landing zone 4 at Vandenberg Space Force Base for reuse.
Stage
6
1 is
minutes into the flight. We've heard a verbal call that the entry burn is underway on the first stage. The visual evidence of that on the right, upper right, you can see the booster
entry burn.
firing 3 of its engines,
Stage 1 FTS is safe.
and there's entry burn shutdown.
Both stages are on nominal trajectories.
Minute remaining until landing of the first stage back at landing zone 4. This booster is booster 1071. It's making its 6th flight to space today. After debuting back in February, its first launch was on February 2nd of this year from Vandenberg with a classified spy satellite payload for the National Reconnaissance Office.
Stage 1 is transcendent.
All of its missions to date have been from Vandenberg Space Force Base. About 30 seconds remaining until landing of the first stage.
Stage 1 landing ready.
Landing burn is underway. We're seeing that now live in this view from NASA.
Landing like deploy.
Landing zone 4 coming into view. And there's
Stage 1 landing is
touchdown.
confirmed.
Booster 1071 is back on the ground, back on Earth, after a 7.5 minute jaunt into space this morning. It is now safely back at landing zone 4, completing its 6th flight to space in its career.
Stage 2 FTS is saved.
MVAC shut down. Nominal parking orbit.
Call from SpaceX Launch Control that the upper stage has achieved a nominal parking orbit after concluding its orbit insertion burn. And in this map, this tracking map shows the dogleg maneuver that was completed after the rocket initially flew on a trajectory toward the southwest from Vandenberg. It is now steered on a more southerly track out over the Pacific Ocean. So that dogleg has been completed, approaching T plus 10 minutes since launch. We saw the Falcon 9 blast off from Space Launch Complex 4, or Slick 4, at Vandenberg Space Force Base at 3:46 a.m. Pacific time, or 6:46 a.m. Eastern. For those of you watching in other places around the world, that's 11:46 a.m. UTC. Now about 32 minutes remaining until the next critical maneuver. That'll be a 5-second burn by the upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket. That 5-second burn will circularize the orbit at about 857 kilometers, or a little more than 530 miles. And that will set the stage for the separation of the Surface, Water, and Ocean Topography spacecraft, or SWOT, at T plus 52 minutes. Again, we saw the landing of the first stage booster, booster 1071. This is a graphic that we made going into the launch showing its previous 5 missions. You can add one more to this graphic now for a 6th flight in the books today. Again, it debuted back in February with the National Reconnaissance Office's NROL 87 mission. It launched again for the National Reconnaissance Office on NROL 85 in April. In June, it launched the German military's SARA-1 spacecraft. That's a German military radar reconnaissance spacecraft. And then it has most recently been employed to launch a pair of Starlink missions for SpaceX's privately run internet network back in July and in October. So booster 1071 now has logged 6 flights in a single calendar year. All of these flights originated from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Minutes, 30 seconds since the launch of NASA's Surface Water and Ocean Topography mission, or SWOT mission. That spacecraft is still mounted to the upper stage of the Falcon 9 rocket, which is now coasting southbound over the Pacific Ocean west of South America. It'll be passing over the Antarctic region and then heading back north on the other side of the world to set up for this upcoming next maneuver at T plus 42 minutes. That'll be a restart of the upper stage engine before separating the SWOT satellite a few minutes later. Again, this is the first of 2 Falcon 9 missions SpaceX is planning on this day, on this Friday, December the 16th, later today. Over at Cape Canaveral, Florida, a Falcon 9 rocket is set to blast off at 4:21 p.m. Eastern Time. A little more than 9 hours from now, with 2 O3B mPOWER internet satellites for SES. These are commercial broadband satellites heading up to a medium Earth orbit. about 5,000 miles or 8,000 kilometers above the equator. And then tomorrow, SpaceX has another Falcon 9 rocket they're preparing for launch from Kennedy Space Center with the next batch of, we believe, 54 Starlink internet satellites. And this mission tomorrow, Saturday, December the 17th, is set for liftoff at 4:32 p.m. Eastern Time, 21:32 UTC. And it will be noteworthy because it will be the 15th flight of a Falcon 9 booster. That'll be a new record that SpaceX will be going for with this upcoming Starlink mission Saturday. 15 flights for a booster. The record to date is 14. 22 minutes since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from Vandenberg Space Force Base. About 20 minutes remaining until the upcoming restart burn of the second stage engine, and about 30 minutes left until payload separation, when we expect to see the SWOT spacecraft fly free of the Falcon 9. 32 minutes since the launch of SpaceX's Falcon 9 rocket from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. I'm Stephen Clark, editor of Spaceflight Now, continuing to provide live updates and commentary on this mission. We're now about 10 minutes away from the next major event, which will be the restart of the Falcon 9's upper stage engine. That'll be a very short burn lasting about 5 seconds. That is tentatively scheduled to begin at T plus 43 minutes and 22 seconds, so about 11 minutes away, actually. And we're now about 20 minutes away from the deployment of the payload, the sole satellite on this mission, the Surface Water and Ocean Topography spacecraft, or SWOT. This is about a 2.2 metric ton or a 4,800 pound spacecraft that has been jointly developed by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, as well as the French space agency CNES. And its mission is to take an inventory of all the Earth's water resources. They'll measure the water volume and height in reservoirs and rivers, as well as the sea level of the world's oceans. As you can see in this map provided by SpaceX, the second stage of the Falcon 9 with the SWOT spacecraft on board is now approaching Antarctica. While we're waiting for this next burn, we're going to show some animation from NASA of the surface water and ocean topography satellite. After separating from the Falcon 9, one of its first major operations will be the deployment or extension of its solar panels out to a span of about 48 feet. That'll be coming just minutes after separation from the rocket. On day 4 of the mission, now early next week, the process will get underway to begin unfurling the booms associated with the Ka-band radar instrument. This will take several days. This will be a very carefully choreographed step-by-step process to extend the radar instrument booms. This radar is the instrument that will be used to measure the elevation of the water in lakes, oceans, rivers, and reservoirs. One side is an active transmitter, and both sides of this boom have antenna receivers that receive signals, Ka-band pulses that have been reflected off of Earth's surface. That is used, those measurements of those reflective signals are used to determine the height of water in reservoirs, rivers, as well as sea level. The spacecraft was built by Thales Alenia Space, and the main instrument, the Ka-band radar interferometer, was developed by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. The mission also has a nadir-facing or down-facing radar altimeter from France, as well as equipment and sensors to precisely determine or measure the satellite's location in space. So here's a map of the coverage of a satellite like this. This spacecraft has, the instrument on this satellite has a swath width of about 75 miles or 120 kilometers. So as it's traveling around the Earth at 850 miles altitude, nearly 900 kilometers, this radar instrument will be painting a swath along Earth's surface about 75 miles or 120 kilometers wide to measure the water levels in that region as it flies around the Earth, and we'll be able to complete a complete map of sea level and freshwater resources every 21 days. This is a follow-up mission from a previous oceanography satellites, such as the Jason series of satellites that have been launched since 2001, as well as the U.S.-French Topex Poseidon mission launched back in 1992. That was really the pioneer in this area. Most recently, NASA and the European partners launched the Sentinel-6 Michael Freilich oceanography mission back in 2020. This mission, the Surface Water Ocean Topography mission, or SWOT, builds upon that legacy and debuts this new Ka-band radar interferometer instrument that we've talked about. And that's what enables this mission to actually expand the coverage, not just over the oceans as the previous satellites did, but it has the resolution and sensitivity to measure water in reservoirs and rivers, freshwater resources as well. So that's the innovation with SWOT compared to previous satellite missions. We're about 2 minutes now away from the expected engine restart on the second stage of the Falcon 9. Now about a minute away from the engine restart. This will be a very brief 5-second burn. Standing by for ignition of the Merlin vacuum engine. The view from the upper stage, there's engine start. Merlin vacuum engine has ignited. And there's engine cutoff. Shutdown of the engine has been confirmed. We'll await a call from SpaceX Launch
Nominal
Control
deploy orbit.
on whether this burn achieved the expected orbit. And SpaceX confirms a nominal deploy orbit. So this means that the Falcon 9 has put the SWOT spacecraft right in the predicted orbit. Now, about 8 minutes remaining until payload separation. Now about 3 minutes remaining until the expected time of separation of the SWOT spacecraft. This is the Surface Water and Ocean Topography spacecraft that launched about 50 minutes ago from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Standing by for separation of the Surface Water and Ocean Topography spacecraft, or SWOT. We're now streaming some views from the Falcon 9 rocket's upper stage in orbit. It is flying north, approaching the Madagascar area.
SWAT payload
And there's
separation.
spacecraft separation. The Surface Water and Ocean Topography spacecraft is flying free of the Falcon 9 rocket in orbit after a successful launch from Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. A good view of the golden thermal insulation on the exterior of the spacecraft here, shining bright in the sunlight over the southern Indian Ocean, heading north in orbit about 530 miles above the Earth at this point. Major steps, one of the next major steps in the life of SWOT will be the deployment of the solar panels. That's expected shortly. Also, in the next 20 minutes or so, ground teams in France will take control of the satellite. They expect to receive the first signals from SWOT, either through a ground station. In the next few moments, there's a chance for a contact. However, the expected first contact, more likely contact, will be in about 20 to 25 minutes. So with SWOT now flying free, it's now deployed from the Falcon 9 rocket in orbit. The next major event will be the solar array deployment and the acquisition of signal from the spacecraft. Here's a look inside the CNES French Control Center in Toulouse, France, where the engineering team is awaiting that first signal from SWOT. We're going to conclude our live commentary and live coverage at this point. We'll have an update in our Mission Status Center and on social media a little bit later to confirm that successful acquisition of signal from the spacecraft. And we'll, of course, have a full recap story on spaceflightnow.com later today. And please join us for the launch this afternoon of a Falcon 9 rocket from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. That launch is scheduled for 4:21 p.m. Eastern Time at the opening of an approximately hour-and-a-half long launch window. That's 21:21 UTC for those of you in other time zones. Again, that mission, a Falcon 9 rocket, is set for liftoff with two O3B mPOWER broadband satellites for the commercial operator SES. Tomorrow, a Falcon 9 rocket is set to launch from Pad 39A at Kennedy Space Center, and we're getting a nice glimpse live at the launch complex right now where SpaceX is lifting booster 1058 vertical. This is a Falcon 9 rocket with a well-used booster going for its 15th flight. This will be a record in reuse for Falcon 9 boosters. This rocket debuted back in May of 2020 with the launch of astronauts Doug Hurley and Bob Behnken on the Demo 2 mission on board the first astronaut flight on a Crew Dragon spacecraft, and has now flown 14 times in total. A very dark booster there has the scorch and soot markings from its 14 flights to space to show for it. Going for flight number 15 on Saturday afternoon. We'll have live coverage of that as well from Kennedy Space Center. That mission will be carrying the next batch of Starlink internet satellites into orbit for SpaceX. And we mentioned the two upcoming Falcon 9 missions on the 16th and 17th later today and on Saturday from Florida. Looking beyond that, on Sunday evening, Rocket Lab has rescheduled their launch of an Electron rocket from Wallops Island, Virginia. This will be their first flight from U.S. soil after flying more than 30 missions from their original launch site down in New Zealand. They're now coming to the United States to begin launches from Virginia. That launch has been delayed a couple of times now. It was scheduled for last week, and then it was scheduled for actually this evening, most recently. And just last night, Rocket Lab confirmed another 2-day delay in that launch, now Sunday evening, with a window of 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time. And next week, December the 20th, on Wednesday, actually Tuesday evening, from down at the Guiana Space Center in South America, Arianespace plans to launch a Vega C rocket. This mission will be carrying two very high-resolution Earth imaging satellites, Pleiad Neo 5 and 6, into orbit for Airbus. This is a very high-resolution commercial remote sensing satellite duo.
To launch team for successful mission.
So with that, we're now approaching an hour since the launch of the Falcon 9 rocket from Vandenberg Space Force Base. It's been a successful mission this morning, and we'll be back this afternoon on our YouTube channel to stream the launch of the O3B mPOWER mission on a Falcon 9 from Cape Canaveral. And we'll leave you with one last look of Pad 39A, where SpaceX is preparing for another launch on Saturday with the Starlink internet satellites on board.